Matthew Buckley Smith, and you are listening to Slee Rickets. Thank you all for listening, and thanks especially to those of you who have taken a moment sometime this week to recommend the show to somebody you think might like it, whether that be a classmate, a teacher, a student, a stranger on the bus, or just some weirdo in your life who has some contrarian thoughts about poetry. That is the primary way people learn about this podcast, through you, through the listeners. So thank you very much. I hope you keep it up and continue to pass the word along. This week, my guest is Mark McGuinness, who is a really good guy he really conceived and researched and pitched this whole episode. He is a very successful podcaster in his own right. He has a podcast called The 21st Century Creative that we didn't even really talk about, because what he is most interested in, what he cares most about personally, is poetry. He just started a podcast called A Mouthful of Air, and along with his own poetry, he's translating all of Chaucer's Troilus and Cressida into modern English, which is pretty mind-blowing, particularly considering that he's maintaining the rhyme royal. But he came on the show to talk about formal poetry and to talk about some problems with the way people talk about formal poetry. He has some slightly unorthodox views. And he also brought in a couple of really excellent essays by Dana Gioia, about whom I have many mixed feelings myself, but who has a really terrific essay about it's a new critique of the new critics that I had not encountered before, and that I find myself pretty convinced by, as well as a very characteristically measured and insightful piece by Robert Archambault about conceptual poetry. Anyway, Mark McGuinness joined me for, I think, a really fun conversation. He is to give you a fair warning, he has an extremely soothing British therapist's voice, which he comes by it truly after many years of training and practice in therapy. But his views when it comes to poetry are by no means easygoing or laid back. He has some strong opinions, and he shares them with me pretty eloquently. So I think you will really enjoy this conversation. I certainly did. Let's get to that right now. There are lots of complaints about formal poetry, and particularly, as Austin said, it's a term that can sound staid, and it sort of it suggests that you're dressing something up rather than just sort of enjoying the process. But then you specifically take issue with the term constraint, and you even say specifically, which I really appreciated, one common defense of formal poetry is constraint as a stimulus to creativity. For example, having to work hard to find a rhyme word leading you to a less obvious, more original line than you would have written if you didn't need a rhyme. I've been listening to these lectures by Jeffrey Hill, and he makes almost exactly that claim. He says the primary function of rhyme is as a stimulus to creativity. So that I certainly understand and have experienced that, but you have, I think, a pretty smart argument against talking or thinking in that way too much.
Yeah, and I want to say too much. I mean, obviously, who am I to contradict Jeffrey Hill?
Sure, yeah.
That would be a way to kick off the interview with a bang, wouldn't it? I think I agree with that point of view. It does act as a stimulus to creativity. It does prompt you to think of, oh, damn, that word that I was going to use isn't quite the right word, and I'm going to have to get the thesaurus out, or dare I say it, even the imagination, and start to think of something new and different, and that can take you new places. And I do think that is a creativity enhancing aspect of form. But I don't think we should reduce it to a writing prompt. Yeah. There's lots of ways that we can get started or get better at writing poetry, but they generally fall away as a scaffold. Whereas to me, the rhyme, for instance, or meter, that's intrinsic to the effect. sure, and so I don't think we want to lose sight or sound of the effect that it has on the reader and indeed the listener, that there's the sonic pleasure of chiming, of rhyming. And this is part of what creates the, we were talking about hypnosis earlier, the slightly hypnotic, trance-inducing aspect of a poetic charm or a spell. That's really where the magic of poetry comes from. And I think we're losing sight of that if we just talk about it in terms of a constraint as an enabling to creativity, which is true, but it's much more than that. I think the result is more important than the stimulus, than the input.
You make a smart point, I think, also about how, when we're making chairs or we're practicing some other craft, music, you talk about, I even think, my sister and her husband are really into mixed martial arts. And I just think like anytime you're practicing an existing craft, very seldom are you thinking about, well, what are the rules and how can I follow them? You're thinking about what you're trying to accomplish. You don't put somebody in a headlock because that's what you're supposed to do. You do it because you're trying to, gain control of them. You build a chair with four legs because the rule is that it has four legs. It's because you don't want it to fall over. And the poetry has for a long time worked in a similar way. All of the conventions of or poetic devices, as we're taught about them in school, exist not just to in order to satisfy some set of expectations, but because they do cool shit.
Right. And it's not like they were, laid down by the examining board or the Barneybone Cricket Club equivalent, who've got the rules of cricket over here. This is what came out of poetic practice. Poets did it because it was cool shit, that it sounded good, that it created a rhythm, it created an effect in the mind and indeed the heart and the body of the listener. And they kept doing it because they could see that it was working, like the way a musician would, go, oh, that riff worked, we're going to keep that one tomorrow night.
Yeah. Oh no, exactly. And I think the connection to live performance is so, I love poetry on the page. I'm very nerdy and I enjoy poetry, well, some poetry classes, but I think that having, when you really lose a connection to live performance, to seeing the effect that what you're doing has on an audience right away, then you begin to lose touch with why any of these choices exist in the first place. Because if as there are various drafts and quarto versus folio editions of Shakespeare's plays, and people argue about what's definitive and who wrote what. But to me, that it's just evidence that when you're doing a show, you see what effect it has on the audience, and you change it the next time to make it a little bit better. And I think that, certainly, like the way we do have poetry readings today, but they're so boring and so awful that there's no sense that you're responding to, like, oh, this got a laugh, or people respond, or like people seem confused. There's sort of no feedback at all there.
I don't know. I think if you can have a good crowd and you can have a good reading, and there can be a bit of a, if you do this more than once in a while, you can think, okay, that seemed to work. Maybe I will do a bit more of that next time.
Do you do a lot of readings?
I don't do a lot. I did the first one since the pandemic started back in November, I think it was, in London for the Ambit. Ambit had a launch for their competition issue. And it was so good being in a room with an audience and actually feeling response to a line or two, and just the energy that was in the room. I think partly because we'd all been pent up and we hadn't had this for so long.
It takes a pandemic
maybe
to make
even the Brits
exciting.
were showing a bit of emotion.
Sure. Yeah.
After a couple of beers, but I think it can be. We've all been to dead poetry readings.
Yeah.
And of course, the elephant in the room here is the spoken word poets, where it's all about the moment and the performance and the audience reaction. I think there's quite there's a real kind of spectrum, I think, between poets writing for the page and for the eye and maybe for the mind, and all the way up to the ear and the body, and maybe the heart is somewhere in the middle.
So one of the things I think you identified that has been it's been a little bit of a nagging feeling I've had in reading a lot of poetry, particularly by, I mean, in the U.S., poetry became very professionalized. I think that's changing now since nobody can get a fucking job. But for a long time, most poets you would have heard of, most poets you would read, are people who are well established in universities, and there's a feeling I often have reading even the work of good poets who very often publish too much and put out books too often. They have a knack for language. They have a certain set of skills they've built up. They're good at what they do, but they are writing poems because writing poems is the thing they are supposed to do. And I think it seems almost as if they're finding occasions where, oh, I haven't written a poem about this yet, or oh, I suppose I should have maybe I haven't done a villanelle in a while, and it seems like the problem with talking about constraints has something to do with the expectation that you're going to be writing poems anyway, and so now what new angle can you put on it? What new writing prompt can you find? And I think that it's related also to poetry being a subject in school that you're going to be reading it and you're going to be interpreting it anyway. And so what lens are you going to put on it? What style of interpretation are you going to put on it?
I think you've summed up why I'm not an academic. I mean, I did an English degree a long time ago, and I got a lot of value in terms of reading and thinking about poetry, but hardly any poems during that period when I was in that mindset. And I realized, for me at least, it was antithetical to actually writing poetry. I can't speak for everyone because for some people it works great, but I can certainly, was it Keats who said, if a poem doesn't come as naturally as the leaves from a tree, it had better not come at all. And I think this has always been my problem, not just with, say, the professionalization of poetry, but the whole idea of writing prompts that you're going to try and force something out, even if, you're not really feeling it. And I guess there is a time and a place for that, to say, look, okay, so today we're going to sit down and we're going to switch off from everything else and see what happens. But I think we've got to be a bit careful about where that initial impetus is coming from.
I mean, it's beautifully said. It also seems crazy in a way to say that poetry should come easily and effortlessly, or not at all, because of course, maybe unless you are Keats or Rimbaud or somebody, I remember there was someone else who said, note that he said it comes as naturally as the leaves from the tree.
Okay. Not as easily.
Okay. Yeah.
So, and I probably mangled the quote, but I'm pretty, I can't remember who it was who was building on that from Keats. Okay. So it's not like, going down the long slide, as Larkin would put it. It's not necessarily nice and easy, but there's a kind of a sense that it's got to come out. It's spring and it's time for it to come out, and it's like, you can't push it a week earlier by doing a writing prompt.
And of course, the leaves on the tree also are not coming out in order to express the feelings of the tree or in order to suit an occasion. They're coming out to keep the thing alive. They're coming out for a very specific
to do
purpose.
The job. Yeah, that's right.
One of the essays that you cited was this Dana Gioia piece on poetry as enchantment, and it felt a little bit like 2 or 3 separate. It's long. I mean, he is a man who definitely a controversial figure in American poetry, and a man who loves the sound of his own voice, even when he's just writing on the page. But I think it's a really terrific essay. So would you give me, so you focused, I think, in the section you quoted on sort of the first maybe half of the essay. He makes this argument about charms and the word Carmen and enchantment. So what is it that you wanted to hit from there? And then I have some other questions as well.
Well, I just think that he'd really picked up on something that just seems to be neglected in poetry, that, he said it's almost hiding in plain sight. The sound, the magic, the enchantment of poetry. And as soon as I say those words, I'm sure some people are thinking, really? It's like we're going back to the 19th century and Tennyson and all of that, but it doesn't have to be that way. And I think this is really part of the root of poetry. There's actually a terrific book. Andrew Welsh wrote this, I think Princeton University. in the 70s or the 80s called Roots of the Lyric. And he talks about, well, he says primitive poetry and modern poetics. Now, clearly, we wouldn't use that kind of language these days to talk about that. But he's talking about, well, where does lyric poetry come from? And he says there are lots of like threads in our culture and prehistory, things like riddles and emblems and ideograms and images. And one of them is the charm, as in the magical spell. And this is something that that Joya has picked up on in the essay, and he's really run with that there is a magical root of poetry that, and we're not talking about magic trick, we're talking about actual magic. This was what it was believed to be. And that there is still a vestigial element of that available to us through, and the way that is conjured is through meter, through rhythm, through form, through rhyme, through repetition, through incantation. And I just thought it was so refreshing and so untrendy of Joya to make that argument. It was in the Dark Horse magazine, which is a kind of a Scottish, it straddles the Atlantic, so it's Scotland and North America, I think.
Yeah, no, it's definitely one I've heard of, particularly among formal poets in the U.S. It's definitely one that's on there.
It's a great magazine.
It's on their radar. Yeah, I mean, it's a terrific essay, and he hits makes the point that the Latin word Carmen, which is all of Catullus' poems are referred to as Carmina, but that's literally the same word as the word charm. He talks about nursery rhymes and various little rhyming traditional wishes and even prayers and sort of pagan incantations, something like starlight, star bright, first star I see tonight, I wish I might have the wish I wish tonight, I think is how it goes. But the point being that poetry is both historically and maybe intrinsically tied to a feeling of both charming the person, but also connecting one's wishes or will to the world. I was especially interested in where he then took this argument later in the essay. He talks about the legacy of the new critics in a way I had not heard them talked about before. Is that, I know they had an enormous impact on the way poetry was taught in the US in the mid 20th century. Did they have, I mean, and they crossed the Atlantic as well, but did that affect British schooling at all the same way? Or what was your experience of that coming up?
It was fairly new to me when I was reading the Joya essay.
Okay.
It didn't seem to me, it hadn't really impinged on my consciousness.
Okay. What was so
which then could be pure ignorance.
Sure. Yeah. So it's funny. My mentor was in high school was a woman who had studied at Vanderbilt and knew a lot of the fugitives and the Southern agrarian formal poets. Or not all formal poets, but the Warren and that group. And she was an evangelist for the new criticism, but in a particular context, which is that in the beginning, the new critics were responding to a kind of a Victorian style of teaching poetry, which, as Joya says, was poetry mostly as the Lucretius calls it the honey around the rim of the glass that's full of wormwood. The poetry was sort of what made the spoonful of sugar that made the medicine go down. It was the fun part. It lubricated education. It was, you memorized it. You learned facts put into verse, sometimes to the detriment of the facts. It was something that you maybe learned morals from, or you sighed at sentimentally, and it was a part of a national tradition, and it was not especially intellectual. The story I remember hearing about Alan Tate was that when he would begin his poetry classes with undergraduates, he would start with a stack of poems, and he would read a poem aloud, and then at the end he would say, "Wonderful," and then flip to the next one and read it and say, "Well, that's quite lovely, isn't it?" And just he would keep doing this until finally and he would read a great variety of poems, some good, some bad, some and he would wait until a student said, "Well, now is that really as good as the last one? Or we're like, what do you mean? And he said, oh, yes, I guess they're not all the same. Maybe we should talk about that. And that would be the way he'd sort of step into this analytical approach to poetry. You see where he's coming from, that he was very dissatisfied with his own education of poetry. But Gioia's claim is that this, in a way, poisoned poetry going forward. That he said when it became something that was no longer sort of fun and popular and unintellectual, when it became a subject to study in school with a set of techniques, very quickly he said he says and this is, you see this in almost every intellectual paradigm shifting development. He said the new critics and their successors changed the way poetry was taught, first in universities and then at lower levels of education. The intellectual revolution of one generation hardened into the pedagogic dogma of another. Classroom instruction gradually narrowed to a few types of textual analysis, increasingly taught to students with limited experiential knowledge of poetry. Coursework focused on critical dissection and conceptual paraphrase of printed texts. He goes on to say that poetry stopped being the fun part, and it started being a serious subject to study with, as you were saying, like almost a scientific approach. That's not really fair to the new critics and how they approached it, but as he says, maybe the new critics weren't the problem, but the people who then copied them were the problem. It became stiff in the same way that like Stanislavski's approach to acting very quickly became the sort of rigid American method acting, which is the opposite of what he would have wanted. So Gioia kind of makes an argument not to take poetry out of schools, but maybe to take it out of schools as a subject proper and to treat it more like an extracurricular or he talks about making it competitive, making it oral again, basically like de-academicizing it. I'm curious, your experience with what was it like for you learning poetry in, say, high school or whatever you call it, what do you call it there?
Secondary school.
Okay, right.
Yeah.
Right.
Actually,
what was it like for you?
Well, I was really lucky. I do find a lot of people, there can be that Frost's two paths really at that age when you're first introduced to it as a subject at school. Some people have really bad experiences where it's kind of put on a pedestal and it's been this lofty thing that mortals like us wouldn't understand. I had a really amazing experience. I had two terrific teachers, Sue Dove and Jeff Riley, who would just, we would spend a whole lesson looking at maybe one or two poems. And it just blew my mind that you could have this little square of text and you could look at it for an hour and talk about it and argue about it for an hour. And at the end of the hour, there would still be more stuff coming out of it. It was like, the magic porridge pot in the fairy tale, that it just kept coming and coming and coming. And I technically now that would be called close reading. But to me, it was just like looking and listening and opening yourself up to the poem. And so for me, that's where it really began. Or I guess you could go all the way back to as a kid listening to nursery rhymes and Edward Lear and so on. But that was certainly the point where I thought, wow, this is an amazing thing. I really want to just devote a lot of myself to this, to getting good at it. Which I think, I had a mixed experience of the academic study at undergraduate level, but in a sense, maybe that early experience had inoculated me that I was never completely convinced that English literature was an academic subject. I mean, it was convenient that it was because I could spend 3 years reading poetry. But I think as poets and as readers and audiences, I think it's fair enough to make it academic study of it because you can study anything and get a lot out of it. There's a lot you can add to that, but it can contaminate our practice as poets and our experience as listeners. And I think we need to be quite wary of that. In other words, it could break the spell.
And that is, I mean, he sort of makes that argument against close reading as a standard in school. I mean, I think I'm with you in that there is, at least for some of us, it can be so fun to get lost in a poem and to pull it apart, but also to just sort of savor all of its elements. But I wonder if I mean, he makes a pretty strong case for treating poetry the way you would treat, like in school, if you have either extracurriculars or special courses or whatever you want to call them, like there may be art, music, even physical education can be sort of like this, where the purpose is not so much a critical academic comprehension and analysis of it as it is a functional familiarity with a practice. I was a drama major, and most of that was not. We didn't really focus much on analysis. It was mostly how do you do it, and how do you do it so so people enjoy it. Which theoretically is what maybe creative writing departments could do, but it doesn't feel that way. Like that's not what most creative writing departments feel like.
Well, I think for me the analogy is a lot of too much academic analysis feels like an anatomy lesson. It's taking the specimen and cutting it up and labeling it and attaching Latin names. Whereas to me, I think as a poet and as a reader of poetry, I'm interested in physiology. How does this thing move and live and breathe, and how do all these parts come together? Because you want to observe it in the wild rather than just kill it and put it in formaldehyde and dissect it.
So you also referred to this article by Robert Archambault in the it was on the Poetry Foundation website, which you're right, I give them so much grief, but they also, they're such an enormous resource that it's crazy not to take advantage of, all the stuff they provide. Again, I think as Cameron said, like their website may be the best thing about them.
It is great. I mean, so many times it pops up on Google when you want a good illustration of something.
Yeah, no, I mean, God bless them for that, whatever other problems they might have. So this was, clearly the connection between these was this question of charm, which Archambault approaches, with maybe a slightly less mystical angle, but it's related. He says there are a couple different things we are concerned with when we're concerned with poetry, and he's talking specifically about conceptual poetry. So yes. What interested you about this piece?
Well, what interested me is I think maybe you could see conceptual poetry almost as an extreme, the extreme end of where you go when you lose touch with the sound and the rhythm and what I've argued and Joy argues is the magic of spoken poetry. Conceptual poetry, you don't even, what's his name? Kenneth Goldsmith.
Yeah.
He says in a lot of his stuff, he says, you don't even need to read it. You just need to get the idea of it. And I mean, I'm sorry at that point, the poem has evaporated. And it's kind of interesting. But, as Archambault says, it's interesting to know that somebody has done this and has pursued it because, God bless them. I guess somebody had to ask the question. But Archambault says, but we lose the charm aspect. And I think maybe he's talking about just personal charm rather than magical charm. But again, it's a continuum. And to me, that is, if you like, an extreme case of what has happened with a lot of so-called free verse, non-metrical verse, non-rhyming, non-formal, in inverted commas. And I want to say, I do like this kind of verse as well. I write it myself. A lot of my best friends write it too. I'm not hating on it. But it's the danger to me is it can end up being quite cerebral, that you end up with something that looks easy on the eye, on the page, and provokes interesting thoughts in your mind, but maybe doesn't touch your heart, let alone the solar plexus. I just think that's something for us to be aware of and watch out for. And, when I wrote to you and I said, well, to me, formal poetry isn't like you. I'm not keen on the connotations of formal, as in formal dress, formal attire, conservatism and so on. And I was listening to the conversation between you and Austin, and I thought, well, why do I like so-called formal poetry so much? What has it got that the other kind hasn't? And to me, it's energy. And that was why I said, to me, it's poetry with a pulse.
Yeah.
And I mean that in terms of just the basic metrical beat, a pulsing sound, but obviously that I think the connotations are more accurate, that there is a pulse, there's an energy, there's a living beat in a metrical poem. And this is precisely what's missing with, by the time you get to conceptual poetry, it's completely disembodied. And I find it weird that, for instance, when it comes to music, imagine pop music or rock music or dance music without a regular beat. It just wouldn't work, would it?
Oh, God.
And yet, and that is supposed to be the subversive, unconservative type of music, right. But it's the polar opposite in poetry. As soon as you introduce the regular beat, you're supposed to be sat there in tweed jackets in a kind of an Edwardian cottage, harking back to the age of Tennyson.
Yeah, you cite this totally insane law. You said here in the UK, when the Conservative government wanted to clamp down on rave culture in 1994, they introduced the Criminal Justice and Public Order Act, which gave police the power to shut down any gathering where 20 or more people were listening to music, in quotes, wholly or predominantly characterized by the emission of a succession of repetitive beats, which is fucking, I can't believe that was a law.
What? Yeah, well, I must admit, there was a vigorous debate about that because it was clearly insane.
I'm very skeptical of any argument in any direction that an art form is intrinsically subversive or conservative, but it was the conservatives who passed this law.
Right. I mean, they were, and it was that specific regular beat which was the thing they homed in on. And in poetry, if you're sitting in a room listening to poetry with a regular metrical beat, then you're assumed to be pretty conservative minded. But if it's music, then police can kick the door down and arrest you and your friends.
I read an essay the other day. I didn't want to send it to you at the last minute because it was a long one and I only read it yesterday, but there's a lot of it was an argument in defense of formal poetry, and it was largely in terms of how, which Austin did a little bit as well, about how formal poetry is really what's subversive. You talk about formal poetry as being the countercultural or alternative. I think your approach is maybe fairer because you're really just saying the convention is free verse. This is a different
right,
thing.
exactly.
And so in that sense, it is an alternative.
And I want to, I use that word counterculture. I know it's got connotations, but trying to use it reasonably neutrally, just in the sense that it is
clinically countercultural.
It's an alternative to the mainstream convention, just as free verse once upon a time was the radical alternative to the stifling convention, and it had become stifling and soporific and stultifying and lots of other words beginning with S. But I just feel, again, I don't want to hate on free verse, but it is the prevailing convention, and I think sometimes it helps to look outside of that.
So my experience in school was that the poetry that was dominant in the school I went to was post-language poetry, very kind of, I thought of as nonsense poetry, and it was smart in some ways, but it was not fun or enchanting or sexy or memorable. And so I think that was a time when like Ron Silliman had his whole screed against what he called the School of Quietude, which was, largely free verse, but very straightforward, accessible lyric poems that aimed to stir an emotion. And that was the tension between poetry that didn't make sense but was smart and provocative, and poetry that made sense but was boring. And my sympathies went out to the boring poetry just because I could follow it. But I think today there's plenty of poetry that is pretty, I don't know that it's accessible, but it's not trying to play language games in the same way. But it seems to be very sentimental and often self-indulgent or just sort of like a new form of a new form of confessionalism, maybe sometimes more grounded in identity. Talking to this very young British poet I corresponded with through the podcast, his attitude has been that that he's much more interested in poetry that's sort of linguistically challenging. That's a little bit more difficult, a little bit thornier, and I think, it's not that he and I necessarily have radically different tastes. It's just that something else was the prevailing norm when he,
Yeah.
at the moment than it was when I was a kid. And I wonder about that with you. Was, you've talked about your response to some of your good teachers and bad teachers. Was there so many of these schools or these arguments or these wars, to me, they seem like they often boil down to a particular either reader or writer being annoyed by what was popular at the moment, and then sort of extrapolating from that a whole theory. So it was you seem like you maybe are a little more allergic to theory because you're more interested in simply in the practice. But did you have any personal experience of that? Any sense that like what stifled or chafed you other than just teachers who weren't necessarily as interested in the fun of poetry?
That's a really interesting question. I don't think I was necessarily chafing against something, but so from memory, the poems that we were studying at school, at secondary school, that really got me excited were Ted Hughes, who actually lived down the road from me in North Devon. And
who also was he was also one who said poems are spells, I believe is what he said.
Yeah, he was very much into the whole shamanistic thing, wasn't he? And for a long time, I read Hughes because it was very relatable, very vivid, very magical, I guess. But it actually took me quite a while to realize that he was a horrendous formal influence on me, because he wrote nearly all in free verse. And I just couldn't get on with that thing. And it was only when later on when I think I got some feedback that what I thought was doggerel was actually, no, there is something there. You should do more of that. That sounds like more your thing.
Yeah, so I wonder, because I have this problem, and I know a lot of poets I know who write mostly in meter and rhyme have the same problem, which is that I wrote a lot of free verse poetry early on, and then had a little bit of a turn and really fell into form pretty deeply. And I now find it almost impossible to compose in free verse. I mean, I can break something up and mess with it once I've written it in form, but I feel like I've lost any instinct for how to compose. You do seem to toggle back and forth between the two. Is there any method or experience of that, or does it all just come to you naturally as the leaves on a tree?
No, if I wish, but I'm not Keats. Actually, it has to be a conscious decision now to write in free verse. I think my default is metrical, and sometimes I have to notice, or occasionally my mentor Mimi Calvati will notice for me that actually this poem really wants to be in free verse, and just let it do that. But I think naturally I gravitate towards the meter, and it's more of it's a conscious departure if I'm doing free verse these days.
I know supposedly Lowell would, during at least parts, this may have been more middle period, but he would write in regular meter and rhyme and then revise ignoring that form. And so you would still have a lot of that would be present in a palm, like a palimpsest, but you'd also he would allow himself then to have passages that broke loose. It's the cliche is hard to avoid. I almost want to say broke free, but that's not quite right. I mean, the same with that free verse already is a propagandistic term in itself.
Yeah. But I see what you mean, and actually that makes sense. Reading a lot of Lowell's stuff is because even if you can't always scan it, you never quite get the sense that there's always the after image, or the palimpsest of the metrical template there.
Yeah. Which, I mean, as my friend Jonathan and other people have noted, there is a real difference between, first or second generation free verse and contemporary free verse, in that they had the skeleton of form by heart already. And
Yeah,
so
yeah,
they're, you can still feel that they are, shaking a thing off rather than having nothing to shake off at
right.
all.
Maybe there's an analogy with digital natives.
Digital native. Yeah. What would that, yeah.
I'm not quite sure which way it would work, but
Yeah. And I'm
the
not sure it
idea
would
that
be,
our children, they've never known a world without all these screens and digital stuff. Whereas for me, at least, um, it was this wave that kind of came over the culture.
yeah. I mean, and there is, the same way that, like, when you see in early, there are certainly exceptions, like, so I think Sophocles in particular comes to mind, but like a lot of early drama, I especially think of like Seneca, it was a little later, but feels sort of like tandem storytelling, where you kind of switch from one speaker to another, and they go on at length making their case or telling their tale, and it takes a while for the medium to find its own natural rhythm. And it's like, when early television shows felt like I mean, they were teleplays. They were plays that were then
Yeah,
filmed
yeah, yeah,
and
yeah,
put on,
yeah.
because we were used to the old medium. And I do think that for a lot of people who didn't grow up already immersed in computers and the internet, there's a kind of a kludgy feeling of like transposing one way of doing things onto a new format.
Yes,
But
there's a
with,
wonderful.
sorry, go ahead. Yeah, please.
Sorry, the thing that comes to mind there is there's a place called the Ironbridge Gorge in the Midlands in England, which is supposed to be the cradle of the Industrial Revolution, where they
Mm,
started smelting iron and doing it on a industrial scale.
yeah.
And they've got the first all iron bridge,
Oh,
but they made it the same way you would make a wooden bridge. You would get all these planks and you would overlay them, and
oh
it's
man,
just a delightful
that's
thing.
amazing.
It's just, I don't know, if you Google it, just Ironbridge Gorge Bridge, and you can see that because they were assuming, yeah, I guess there were just so many assumptions embedded in the structure of the bridge that you would have to, like, for instance, lay the plank. You couldn't have them all together because,
Right. They
one,
didn't know how to
the
take
wood, the
advantage
grain of the
of
wood.
iron. Yeah.
I mean, I'm not a carpenter, but there's
Yeah.
certain things
Yeah.
you have to do about the way you lay planks of wood together or wooden beams together to allow for the
Right.
properties of wood that just didn't apply to iron. And it was only later on they realized, oh, we can just have a flat bridge, for instance.
No, I mean, that totally makes sense. And of course, later on, one of the part of what something like iron allows you to do is you can use the new medium in a more elegant way once you get used to that, rather than trying to impose an old way of doing things on the new medium. What I wonder about is, where is that elegance and innovation in free verse poetry? And I don't know. You would, in a way, like, I don't see, with the exception maybe of like typographical innovation, which always feels so underwhelming to me. Like, I don't know, like, typographical whimsy just feels like, okay, well, you can put it anywhere on the page. Like, who fucking cares? Like,
Well,
where is where are the suspension bridges or the new elegant constructions for free verse natives? I don't know. What do you see?
I'm not sure about native. Well, if you just maybe set aside the natives
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
question,
Yeah.
but just specifically, what are the opportunities of free verse and how's that been realized? I think there's certainly maybe a heightened awareness of lineation and line breaks and how they can function, because you can't, particularly when you're looking, writing or reading for the eye.
Yeah.
And there's some wonderful moments where, the end of the line and the word that appears on the next line, you can have all kinds of effects there. I think maybe because you don't have meter to play with in terms of establishing the sonic pattern of the line so much, that maybe that comes to the fore. And I
Yeah.
think, I mean, you look at Williams's little poems they're just so, there's so much depends upon. I know that's
Yeah.
But it's actually, I guess, if we're going back to the bridge analogy, there's quite a lot depending on the way he arranged the words on that page. And I think there's a delicacy and a strength that comes from that you wouldn't need to get to if you had meter, because you'd be focused on that more.
Right. Yeah, and no, I mean, I think that probably is fair, but it's in the same way that like slant rhyme, at least in part, developed from the great vowel shift. That like we started encountering words that they were originally true rhymes, but then we get to encounter them as slant rhymes, and we kind of discover a new, subtle flavor in that variation. The same way that I think probably a lot of free verse came out of translation. That we're reading a poem that had been translated into a new language without in a more literal way, and so suddenly we see, oh, well, this is actually sort of it. So like if you take a poem and rather than trying to build a new poem in meter and rhyme, if you just try to translate the lines line by line, that's going to even if you're translating a perfectly formal poem, it's going to render it into a new thing. And so I think that's you can see how that kind of experience would lead one to say, well, I didn't know this was a thing you can do, but now that I'm looking at it, it's kind of cool. I kind of like it. And I think you're probably right that the real innovations of free verse are probably visual. They probably are on the page. And I know what you mean about the pleasure of looking at a really spare poem on a big white space, but it is, to return to the Gioia, maybe you do sort of have to step away from poetry out loud. You have to step away from the incantation in order to appreciate that for itself.
And I think that's cool, and that's a great thing to do.
Yeah.
And metrical verse opens up the door onto incantation and charm and rhythm and so on. I mean, at the minute I'm doing an occasional concrete poetry project with an artist where when I say we, I mean Sheena Devitt.
Right, yeah.
She's carving the words into stone, and we're coming up with a sculptural concept. And of course, there's no incantation or meter or rhythm in that. We're looking purely at the visual, tactile element, and that's a great thing to have a door onto that aspect of poetry.
And so when you say concrete, because actually there was an example I wanted to. When you say concrete poetry, you mean something specific that is a little different from what I initially learned concrete poetry as. When I learned the term concrete poetry, what I understood that to mean was poetry that made some kind of visual presentation on the page, and that the visual presentation was as important as the verbal content. And Easter Wings being like a Herbert example.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then this is actually a poem that by Alice Allen, who's if you don't know what the podcast Poetry Says is worth checking out. She's an Australian poet, but I quite like this poem from her first book. I don't know if you can see it well, but it just fills the whole page, and it's just
Does it work?
It's so it says it's in a series of sort of periods, but it says birth, filling up several lines, and then it shifts to school, and then work is most of the page, and then the end is just death.
Oh, that is delightful.
And it's wall to wall fills the page, and it's you wouldn't read it word by word straight across, but you look over the page and you gain something from it, and that's something you couldn't do that auditorially, and you do need to sit and look at a page. So that is a kind of poetry on the page that is I wouldn't even know that I would call that free verse. It's almost a separate thing. But that's what I had always thought of concrete poetry as. You're talking about something very different.
Well, I think it's kind of the same. It's on the same continuum. So to me, concrete poetry is just where the concrete expression of the poem is salient. So the print, the visual presentation on the page, I think is one obvious way of doing that. But it could also be painted or sculpted or embroidered, or I don't know if you've come across in Hamilton Finlay's garden, Little Sparta. where up near Edinburgh in Scotland.
Oh.
Well, Sheena showed me this. I've never seen it, but it's obviously it's hard for listeners to imagine. But there's if you can see that photo, it is a set of stones on a hillside with words carved in the stones. And the idea is that he's not saying that, this is a version of the poem carved in stone. He's saying that this is the poem, right, and that the hillside and even the mountains in the distance are the page. And so when you walk around in his garden, he'll have poems appearing carved in, the banisters of a bridge or in the bridge itself. There are some poems that they're carved in wood or stone, but they're only legible because they're carved in reverse when you look at the reflection in the water.
Oh, wow.
And so it's like a hide and seek game. But when you walk around the garden, you are inside poetry, which I think is a...
Yeah, I mean, and you could almost say you're also inside sculpture. You're also inside, do you know, I'm trying to remember his name. Is it Andy Goldsworthy? Is that the guy?
Yeah, Andy Goldsworthy.
Yeah. So it's an immersive experience, which also, maybe less abruptly than with some of his sculptures, will change and erode over time. It'll be different depending on the conditions in the moment, as well as, over, as it is exposed to the elements over time. Would you describe, as I saw one photograph of one of your concrete poems, would you describe kind of in particular what at least one of them looks like, or what some of this collaboration looks like?
Right. So we've just got one finished at the moment. We did it for an exhibition about endangered species. And of course, when I heard about that, we got the list of endangered species. I say, can we do the fox or the lion or something exciting? But Sheena, it was a bit more subtle. She said, no, let's do moss, because moss is often overlooked. Apparently, moss is foundational for all kinds of ecosystems. If the moss disappears, then lots of the bigger critters are going to disappear soon.
And it's extremely fragile too.
And so we worked together. We kind of developed it via email and conversation, this idea of what we were going to do. And she's got this beautiful piece of sandstone, and she chiseled it all over so that's the texture of moss, which must a huge amount of work. Oh, God, and we had the words moss appearing, going all the way down the stone, and it's kind of mesmerizing when you look at it, because it's just that repeated texture of moss, a bit like Amy's poem. But as you go down the stone, the letters start disappearing. And so the moss is going missing, and near the bottom it says miss. So we called that elegy for moss, because it also looks a bit like a headstone.
And that's one you wouldn't read that left to right the way you'd read a sentence.
No, I couldn't. No, there's no auditory component for that. And I think this is really one of the things that I love about poetry so much, is it's almost like an amphibious art form. It could be in the land or in the air. It can be in the ear or in the eye. And you can go all the way up to the conceptual cerebral isthmus or peninsula, if you like, on one hand, or you can go all the way into the concrete expression, or you can go into the sonic dimension where it becomes a sound. There's lots of different lots of different rooms that we can enter in the house of poetry.
Yeah, and I think that's a point that Archambault makes in the Charmless and Interesting piece on conceptual poetry, which is that I think it's very easy to make fun of conceptual poetry, and Kenneth Goldsmith is currently very out of favor because he did the Body of Michael Brown poem, which seemed to be almost he seemed almost to describe the reason that was a bad idea to begin with, because he said that conceptual poetry should not try to do anything. It should not try to be activist poetry, or should not try to take up a cause, but should sort of exist in this stasis on its own. And he seemed not to take his own advice, and then to make this sort of grotesque misstep with that poem.
Yeah.
But I think it's easy as it is to dismiss or make fun of conceptual poetry, especially now when it's a little less fashionable. I think Archambault's right that while it is certainly charmless, it is interesting. And at least people like you and me find it, it's irritating as I find Kenneth Goldsmith. I I was interested to learn about what he's doing, and it's a curious
Yeah.
thing to turn over in one's mind. But
Hmm.
that distinction that Archambault makes, I think, clarifies maybe some of what Joy is also getting at, which is that it's great for poetry to be interesting. It's also great for it to be charming, and we may have at least in our academic treatment of it, privileged the former at the disadvantage of the latter. We may have too much expected it to be, because it can be charming to a very wide audience. It's probably only going to be interesting to a relatively small number of people.
Right. Right.
And maybe that's as much as I find Joya irritating at times, I think he makes a pretty good argument for letting poetry be for letting charm lead the way when it comes to a
Yeah.
popular introduction to poetry for kids, for students, for a non-academic audience. And there will always be room for poetry
and even
nerds
for
to think about.
adults. I mean,
Yeah.
I think, why should we be denied the pleasure? There's
Oh God, yeah.
the Frost, the famous Frost line, poetry begins in delight and ends in wisdom. It almost feels like, well, we're kind of puritanically skipping the delight because we feel we should be doing something more serious. And I think one of the things about poetry is it's like music. It gives a lot of pleasure.
Yeah.
And it doesn't detract from, if you like, the high seriousness or the intellectual endeavor and so on. I don't think it's a dichotomy, just the way Larkin said, the trouble with being funny is people think you're not being serious. He said that's a risk you take. You could say that the trouble with trying to have a spell, to have something that is charming in the original sense, is that people will dismiss it as nursery rhyme fodder.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, and that is, if as much as it is anything else, Joy's essay is a pretty good argument for hip hop being the thing that is maybe going to save poetry, because it's something people find charming and entrancing and don't need to be convinced to sit down and study.
You don't need to be told why it's good and why you should like it.
And you could imagine a sort of a deadly academic project that would be, let's bring hip hop into schools and let's put it in class. Let's study this. You could very quickly, and
suddenly it would be the least cool thing ever.
Oh God, you could really poison it. And it's funny, even like, because I, as a kid, especially because of my mentor, was kind of thought of myself as a champion of new criticism, which was totally out of vogue when I was in school. But again, what I was most interested in was reading the actual poems. And when I was coming up, the prevailing attitude was that the only way to study literature was by way of critical theory, so that you were interested in the larger social, historical, economic, and philosophical implications of the work rather than in the work itself. And to me, the appeal of new criticism was not that it was analytical. It was not that it was stuffy and more concerned with the interest than the charm. It was that you were looking at the actual poems. You were rather than reading books about poems.
Exactly. That's why I ran a mile from theory when I was at college.
Yeah, I wanted to just because I'm curious specifically, and you brought up this play by Young Jean Lee, who's so brilliant and so frustrating at times. I tend to find her work, like, I'm always interested in what she's doing, even if sometimes it seems idiotic, because she can be so brilliant at times. So you saw the play Straight White Men that she did a few years ago. That's one I heard about, but I didn't, maybe just because my eyes immediately glazed over, because I've been overexposed to straight white men in my own experience, obviously. Yeah. So I've not read that one or seen it. I'm just curious, what was that like? Could you give a little brief review or account of it?
Yeah, and so the reason I mentioned it to you is because I was just thinking about the idea of, because very often the discourse around form is, if you are using a traditional form, then you're assumed to be harking back to the Edwardian or the Victorian or the Elizabethan age or even further, and it's supposed to be a nostalgia trip. But to me, it's a little insulting to assume that if somebody's writing in a traditional form in the 21st century, that they're not aware that the context has shifted. And the context is always a big part of that.
Yeah.
And so another example that came to mind was Terence Hayes' book, American Sonnets for My Past and Future Assassin.
Mm-hmm.
Because, this is, and they are sonnets, and they look like sonnets, but he's prefaced some American sonnets, which is drawing attention to the context. And it's a Black poet writing in the age of Trump. So there's something unsettling and destabilizing about the positioning of sonnets there.
And I think there's want to call me because I believe that American Sonnets was. I mean, I know.
Oh, that's right. That's where
what's his name? There was also Gerald Stern did American Sonnets, and his were they were even more looser than Hayes's. But I think there's you're right that he's distinguishing. This is not sonnets. It's not English sonnets or Italian sonnets. This is American sonnets, and so there's a little bit of a tradition there. But then he's got his own angle. Right,
but it's just that. The context changes the way the form is perceived. And it's like, well, what are we to make of the sonnet? Is he critiquing it? Is he embracing it? Is he reinventing it? Is he, and maybe he's doing all of those things. But, and that was why the young Jean Lee example came to mind, because I don't want to give any spoilers for anyone who hasn't seen it, but when you walk in,
we spoil things all the time.
It's quite in your face. There's loud pulsating music. There are non-binary people who are literally in the face of the audience, and it's kind of glorious, really. But it's not for the faint-hearted.
Yeah.
And it kind of screams, this is not going to be your traditional, theatre as heritage evening.
Sure.
And then embedded within that, there is a fairly straight narrative play about straight white men. And it's got an all-male cast, and they're all white. And yet the other framing kind of comes in I think that comes in about halfway through and also at the end. So you never quite forget that this is taking this apparently straight play in every sense. It's kind of linear and whatever. It's taking place in a fairly raucous and disruptive context. And so that changes the framing of all the way through. You can't forget what has just come before, even though you're looking at these two bros arguing on the sofa together.
So they don't seem as much like a default. They seem more like a specific choice.
Well,
or
if you had the play, I mean, if you had the same play without the framing device, it would be a completely different play, just because she's inviting us to look at this and consider this as straight white men.
Right. That this is a specific thing rather than being like the background radiation. Like, no, because I know plenty of people talked about like maleness or whiteness has been treated for a long time as a blank, as like,
right.
Not even a choice, not even a specific. Identity.
It's the background against which everything else or everyone else is judged, and yet this was flipping it around and showing them against a very different background. I mean, I've edited poetry magazine. I know you have as well, I think. And so some of what appears in the postbag is formal verse written by people who clearly haven't read much modern poetry.
Right. Oh yeah, certainly. Yeah.
And you can see that, and there's a kind of, oh, okay, so there's a bit of catching up to do for this person if they want to, play in this space. But
yeah, I mean,
what you're talking about, sorry.
No, well, just because like very seldom have I read a piece of formal verse that I thought was perfectly realized, and all that it was lacking was an awareness of contemporary culture. That typically, like, it's not just that they're not up to date culturally or historically, it's also that the poem's not so great on its own. Like, I won't like see a poem and think like, oh, this would have been a perfectly realized formal piece of poetry 100 years ago, but today it's missing something. I think it typically it's already missing some other things as well.
Oh yeah. I think that's a fair point. But I was just thinking about that they were using the form naively, like without an awareness that there was an alternative. Whereas anyone writing formal poetry now who's kind of alert to what's going on, it's a conscious choice they've made. They know they could have been writing something else. And therefore you could say that there should be ideally and maybe a creative tension, or at least a dialogue going on between that context and what and the form, which is inherent in what the poet's putting out there. That made sense though.
No, actually that makes a lot of sense, and it also clarifies, I think, what is not remarked upon quite enough, which is that most free verse poets today are writing free verse naively. They're not choosing to write free verse. It's just the thing that you do. It's the way that, like, I used to teach English at a little ballet conservatory, and it was overwhelmingly girls, but there were, a few boys in every class. And like, by the time I got them, they were 17 or 18. If you're a boy in the West taking ballet, by the time you're 17 or 18, like, you're tough as nails. Like, they were not accidentally taking ballet. Like, this is not like they were like, I was playing football because it's just the thing you do. It's like they were making a choice to do it. And I think there is something, if you're a poet who has any exposure to the culture at large, and you are still writing formal poems as a grown-up, you've made some choices to do that. Whereas I think the converse is not at all true for most free verse poets.
And the stance could be different. It could be ironic. It could be deliberate contrast.
Which could be ironic.
Sorry, the stance of the poet using a form.
Oh, yeah.
Or it just could be a little more subtle. It could be, here, because I think when you build a house, like if you think of a poem as a house, you're always aware that it's a house of cards. It's going to fall down. And so there can be a poignancy in making something that is all four square and looks so solid, and yet we know what the inevitable fate is going to be,
right? Which is was one of the classic subjects of lyric poetry since forever, right? But this is
exactly.
This is extremely, this is totally ephemeral. I was just going to say that you actually, because Terence Hayes' book is one I have very mixed feelings about, because it's so good where it's good, and I think sloppy in many places, and it was written very, very quickly, I would say hurriedly, but something that he does preserve from the sonnet tradition that has often been neglected in recent memory is the sequence. That as with Shakespeare or Dante or Petrarch, he is writing relatively quickly a series of sonnets that they're not all about the same thing, but they have a sort of a slowly shifting set of concerns. And in some ways you can see him taking a few different runs at a similar topic, in the same way that, like, the first, 14 or 15 sonnets of Shakespeare's are all the same argument, basically. And that's that is a really cool thing about that book, is that we have kind of lost in a lot of contemporary sonnets. We don't see that quite as often as we used to. So I have to give Hayes real credit for that.
And also, here's another thing I noticed at the end, at least in the British edition. We've got the sonnet index, which has got the first line of all the sonnets.
Right.
But delightfully, he's arranged it in pages of 14 lines each. So each one,
I don't think that's in my edition.
Well, the effect is you could read the index like another collection of sonnets, which is a mashup of lines from the other sonnets, which again, that wouldn't have happened in 1692.
No. Yeah, that's a typographical innovation. Yeah. You need,
right.
You
so
need
that's that, but that's a kind of postmodern playful, that's form, but with an eye to the fact that there are alternatives. And
postmodernism has such a complicated reputation and can be so annoying. But I think you do, in your note, you do make, I think, a really worthwhile point, which is that you said postmodernism is not nearly as puritanical as modernism in what is considered formally acceptable. In many different art forms, postmodernists habitually use traditional forms in ways that are superficially straight, but that undercut or reframe them in various ways. And you talk about Pulp Fiction, and that's when you bring up the straightway men. But that is right. That, like, I've certainly, like, when postmodernism, as in like the Norton anthology of postmodern poetry, when it's institutionalized, it's sort of dreadful. But you're right that as with like, Joy would say, very old fashioned approaches to poetry, the best of postmodernism is about having fun.
Yeah, and I certainly wouldn't go the whole hog with it, but I do like the playfulness and the freedom, and the fact that you can relish, I don't know, a good old music hall tune, while at the
Yeah.
same time still being quite arch clever about it, and you can have your cake and eat it.
So you, as you said, you have this practice of coaching artists, and you have a podcast that sort of has something like that as its focus. The 21st Century Creative, is that?
Well, that's my
Well, that I was going to
coaching
say you have a
podcast.
newer one that's about poetry that I wanted to
I have
distinguish. Yeah,
Yeah,
but
so the poetry podcast might be
mouthful of air.
more of interest. So I stole the title from Yeats,
Mm-hmm.
where he said in one of his poems, "Inevitably to Maud Gone," he said, "I made it out of a mouthful of air," talking about the poem. They take this song and weigh it with the great and the pride. I made it out of a mouthful of air,
Yeah.
and I just love that emphasis on the ephemerality and the physicality of a poem. That's what it is made of, and that's where it came from. And it struck me that a podcast is the perfect medium to get back to the oral roots of poetry,
Yeah.
where you've got, in the good old days, it would have been the bard or the skald in the mead hall, where you were around around the fire, and you hear this voice in your ear, and it transports you
Mm-hmm.
in the Joyan sense. And I thought, well, wouldn't it be nice to have a podcast where we do that? And so what I do is I alternate old and new poems. So I have a lot of old stuff like Shakespeare and Yeats and Thomas Wyatt and Emily Dickinson and so on. And then I alternate that with a contemporary poet. And every episode, the first thing you hear is the poem,
Mm-hmm.
because you shouldn't have to have it explained to you if it's any good. You shouldn't have to be told why it's good or what to look out for. If it doesn't give you a visceral or emotional response at first time, then maybe that's the poet's fault rather than yours.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then we have a bit of context. So if the poet's alive, then I'll interview them about the poem, and I'll ask, where did it come from and how did the form evolve? And I get all kinds of interesting responses to that. If they're dead, I have to kind of wing it, and I come up with my own ideas, and I just talk about what I think Shakespeare's doing with the turn here, or what Wyatt's doing with Rhyme Royal and harking back to Chaucer and so on. But again, I guess it's close reading in podcast form, because I'm really focusing on hopefully the physiology rather than the anatomy, how the poem works, how it fits together. And then at the end of each episode, you will hear the poem again. And the idea is that it should sound different the second time you hear it because of that added context. And, it's a little bit of a magic eye idea.
Oh yeah,
there will be things that jump out at you.
Oh yeah, I really appreciate that too. Just because I have such a hard time following poems read aloud, that in any context, what I always want is, no, wait, let me hear it again. So I think
Yes.
that helps a lot, because just hearing it the once, it's so easy for it to just slip past. This is something that it feels like you're doing really. Oh, A Mouthful of Air is something it feels like you're doing sort of really purely out of a love of poetry, that it doesn't really, so much of poetry conversation, at least over here, feels like networking. And this is
Right.
purely whether it's contemporary poetry or old dead guys poetry, it really just feels like something you're doing purely out of the love of it.
And I'm sure you and a lot of listeners will relate to this. Very often I'm the guy who reads poetry in the circle of friends. And
Oh, like among your friends, you're the one poetry guy.
among
Yes.
the non-poetry friends, right?
Yeah.
Being the odd one out. And most people, most of the time, will read just about anything but poetry.
Yeah.
And I just think people are missing out. So I just want to take a poem down from the shelf and read it, and just say, look, isn't this great? Look, notice what he or she's done here. Isn't that fantastic? And it's the same, because a lot of the first poets who've been on the show are poets that I've known for a while, that I kind of grew up in workshops together. Sitting in a workshop, just listening to an amazing evening's worth of entertainment, which is what I've often experienced over the years, just thinking, really, this should be more widely known. I don't think it's that hard for normal people, in inverted commas, to get what is great about this poem. And so that's what I want to do with the podcast. I mean, obviously, I want to have enough. I don't want to dumb it down. This is the challenge. I want to make sure that there's enough for the hardcore poetry geek to be interesting. But again, to me, that's the challenge. I think you can, and I talk about all the technical aspects of the poem, meter and form and lineation and enjambment and all of that. But I just think if you approach it from the way the poet approaches it, which is as a craft rather than an academic discipline, I think it's not that hard for people to relate to and grasp. So that's what I'm trying to do.
That is what today feels almost like a fantasy, is a healthy readership of poetry that are not all poets themselves. That is the dream.
So. Yeah, it is. And just for it to be one of the things that people notice and enjoy, like pop music or movies or the theater, it's not,
without feeling an obligation to satisfy some critical duty to it, just to be able to enjoy it, and then maybe
somehow
learn more if they want to.
Yeah, or rather than the idea that it's good for you, you should spoon this down.
Any off the cuff a poem or something you're reading that's maybe would be worth people knowing about that they might not already know?
What kind of thing are you in the mood for?
I don't know. I mean, this is like a coda, a closing note, of an envoy or something.
Well, actually, should I read the Yeats one, because that is a mouthful of air?
Oh, that'd be great. Yeah, it's perfect. Yeah, please.
Let's practice what I preach and not say too much about it before I read it.
Yeah.
So it's called and it's very short. Okay, so blink and you miss it, or maybe play it, hit the back 30 seconds button on the podcast.
Right.
It's called He Thinks of Those Who Have Spoken Evil of His Beloved by W.B. Yeats. Half close your eyelids, loosen your hair, and dream about the great and their pride. They have spoken against you everywhere, but weigh this song with the great and their pride. I made it out of a mouthful of air. Their children's children shall say they have lied.
There's nothing like a good malediction, and that's one that's both a love poem and a malediction. So
isn't it? He's really sticking it to them. Yeah, and it's a little bit. I mean, there's several things that we would find troubling, I think, now. Telling the lady to arrange herself decorously for his contemplation. But even so, in the end of it, he's just trying to stick the knife in, and I think he's not sure he's. I think the real molten core of the poem is in the middle. Where he says, weigh this song with the great and their pride. I made it out of a mouthful of air. And I think that's what any poet is trying to do, really.
Yeah.
We certainly don't have far to look for the great and their pride these days. And I think maybe he's suggesting something about what the consolation of poetry can be in the, in the midst of everything.
Beauty and revenge. of a certain
beauty and
kind.
Revenge. Was it Keats said beauty and truth, and beauty and revenge?
Now,
well, I mean, as the point I make on the podcast, I think when he's going for revenge, I think he loses the poem. It's not such good poetry.
Oh, I mean, I don't know. I maybe just because I'm less interested in that as a piece of rhetoric than I am as an evocation of a feeling. I mean, like as people have said of a lot of elegies, it's not, sometimes they're self-centered or they're self-absorbed, that we don't learn a whole lot about her, but we do get a very sharp sense of his feeling, and not necessarily that it's a laudable one or one we should celebrate, but it rings true. I know that. I know that feeling. And like there's spleen as part of the human experience.
Indeed.
Yeah. I mean, that's why I think of like Horace's. He has some nasty stuff. I mean, I'll say Catullus can be so nasty it's just ugly, but I think Yeats is a little more Horatian in that he's also aware that he is a fool. It's both humble and prideful. which is
it's good humble brag. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Which I think you need a lot of humility and a lot of arrogance to be a poet. I think is my experience.
Amen to that.
That was my conversation with Mark McGuinness, host of A Mouthful of Air, and just amazingly tolerant and patient guy because my house was in a state of profound disorganization when I spoke with him, and I am very grateful for his good graces in dealing with the chaos on my end of the Zoom call. You can find Mark on Twitter at Mark McGuinness. He is the host of A Mouthful of Air, as well as the 21st Century Creative. Thank you so much for listening. You can reach me as always at sleerickets@gmail.com or on Twitter, where somebody other than fucking me will be answering tweets for a long time here on out. At sleerickets on Twitter. Thank you again for listening. With any luck, I will be speaking to you all again very soon. Until then.